Hi guys, my name is Courtney and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a book review. I'm going to be reviewing The Ruthless Lady's Guide to Wizardry by C.M. Waggoner. So The Ruthless Lady's Guide is an adult fantasy novel. It's technically a companion, I think, to this author's first book, but it can be read as a standalone and I read it as a standalone. And this book follows Dellarina Wells, who is a down-on-her-luck fire witch, and she takes on a bodyguard position to pay her rent. I gave this 3.5 stars, so I really enjoyed it, but in the end there were factors that made this just an average read for me, or a little bit above an average read. So I'm going to discuss some of the reasons why I liked it, some of the reasons that I felt were a detriment to the book, and yeah, let's get into it. So as far as content warnings or trigger warnings for this book, there is a big theme of drug addiction, and there is some drug use. It is a magical drug, but it's implied to be pretty similar to things that we have in our world. And then there is a suicide at the end of the book. These might not be all the trigger warnings or content warnings that this book has. These are the ones that I personally noticed, and I definitely recommend looking into them if you're sensitive to things. This book isn't extremely grimdark or anything, definitely more of a lighter fantasy, but there are some darker moments and some violence and stuff like that on page. So my initial thoughts while reading this book was that I was very captured and enraptured by this unique Victorian setting, and I found the characters to be very enjoyable and likable people. I really like that our main character, Dellarina Wells, or Deli as she is referred to, I really enjoyed that she was not a royalty person or even like a merchant class. She was in this Victorian setting and she was definitely very low caste. Both in like historical fiction and in fantasy novels, I feel like we don't get to see a lot of people from like a labor class, so I thought that was really interesting to have. But the big thing that I kept thinking about when I started reading this book was that I came into this book thinking that it was going to be a bodyguard royalty, or just kind of a bodyguard fantasy novel, and it's definitely not that. Especially in the first half of the novel, the first third of the novel, it is centered on her taking a job as a bodyguard, but that's not all what this book is, and her love interest is not the person she's guarding. It is somebody else that is also taking on this job to be a bodyguard. So I just wanted to put that out there. This book didn't fill my hopes and dreams of a bodyguard-centered sapphic fantasy, and I do wish that I would have known that going in. I wasn't disappointed, but I got something I didn't expect, and I think other people should be aware of that going in. And this novel, I would say, is much more of like an adventure, heist, revenge story than a bodyguard protecting story. But if you are going into this book for a sapphic romance at the core of a fantasy novel, that is what this is. I would say the core of this story is the relationship between the two main characters, so if that's what you're going into this book for, yes, this book does fulfill that. So let's talk specifically about the writing. I thought the writing in here was very interesting. It was almost a combination of like Charles Dickens and like Tolkien. This book had like the air and writing style of a Victorian novel, but like a Victorian novel that never really existed, kind of the Victorian novel that exists in our imagination, which I kind of loved. It was like the perfect blend of like this pompous, over-the-top writing style, but it also was very silly and very self-aware of itself. It was really engaging prose and it was really fun, and it just added to the air, the atmosphere of the story. The only negative thing about this novel with the writing is that sometimes the writer was not great about cutting details. Like I said, it kind of reminded me of Tolkien, and the way it reminds me of Tolkien is that every single step of the journey is described. You know exactly what they eat at every moment. There's not really days skipped. It'll at least give you like a big summary of every single day, and personally for me that gets a little repetitive and a little tiring. I would rather know what the characters are thinking and feeling than seeing every little small action that they do, and that's kind of one of the things I was looking for, was that I wanted to know more about Deli's internal thoughts and thinking, because I did find her really interesting, but because of the writing style, it is a little bit distant from the characters and like their internal thoughts and feelings. The next thing I want to talk about is the setting. So like I said, this is like a fantasy Victorian setting. It almost has like a steampunk feel to it, but not quite. It's definitely more in the Victorian time period. It reminded me a little bit of like Howl's Moving Castle, more the book Howl's Moving Castle than the movie, but just that kind of feel of a Victorian-esque familiar fantasy world. There was a lot of interesting things going on in the background of the story. Like I could tell that there was like caste hierarchy, economic, situational problems. There was deep political systems that never really got explored but are kind of hinted at. There's like a deep world of magic in here that's never quite explained besides what the characters do, and that's kind of the idea of, instead of like opening the door to a world and seeing every little detail, you're kind of just given a window picture view. So there's all this stuff going on underneath the surface of the story. There's a lot more going on, but you kind of just get a peek into it. Personally, I was just so fascinated by everything that was going on, especially with like the political, magical systems that were happening, and I wanted a little bit more of it. But for the story that this author was trying to tell, I think it did work to not have it super well fleshed out. We just got enough, a taste, to understand that there was this wider world going on. Now let's get into the characters. The characters were my favorite part of this story. I thought they were colorful and carefully crafted and interesting. Deli is a very complex character. She has a lot going on. She's dealing with a lot, and sometimes I don't think everything was super nuanced well or like talked about well with like Deli's internal state and kind of like where she was making mistakes. But overall, she was flawed, she was interesting, she was complex, and I thought she just had a really good voice. But the star of this novel was definitely the love interest Win. Win is like a half troll aristocrat woman, and she is just so cute and so charming, and oh my god, she is the first herbo that I've ever seen in fiction, and I loved her. If you don't know what a herbo is, it's basically the female equivalent of a himbo. Bimbo is something different. Bimbo is a woman who is beautiful, a little bit ditzy, but very kind, whereas a herbo is closer to a himbo, meaning they are very muscular, very buff, very kind, and very ditzy. She's this like over 6 foot tall, massive woman who just cares so much for Deli. She is so kind and sweet and just like a little bit naive, but very cute, adorable. I don't know how to describe it. She's just adorable. I want more love interests like her because I loved her. Overall, because I loved Win, because I found Deli really compelling, they made for a really interesting couple. I really loved the complex relationship between the two. Once they get together, there is a lot of back and forth between like internal conflicts. They come from different economic stances, they come from different situations and lifestyles, and they talk it through. This book definitely felt more like a romance with a fantasy background, and honestly, that's kind of what I wanted. That's what I was looking for in this book, and I really enjoyed that. So if you are looking for a sapphic fantasy novel, yes, this is a good choice. But let's kind of get into one of my biggest critiques of this novel, which is the plot. This book dragged. It dragged a lot. I think part of it was due to the writing style and kind of having to see every single little detail of this adventure, but a lot of it was just like the plot stuff. We kind of bounce around quickly from place to place, especially in like the first third half of the novel. Because we were bouncing around from like objective, bouncing around from place, it kind of made the through line, the connected through line of the story feel a little bit weak. Particularly the second third of the novel, it's focusing in on them making this drug so that they can get to this person that they need to capture, and they spend so much time talking about this magical drug, setting up a laboratory for it and putting it together and all this stuff, and it felt a little weird because the end game wasn't even to make a successful drug. It was basically to just trick somebody into letting them get into a particular place so that they could take this person. At times, especially when it was so hard focused on the making of this magical drug, it just felt really weak because it's like, that's not really important to the main plot. This is just a ruse. Why are we spending so much time on this? And honestly, a lot of times the plot felt like it was less about making a coherent plot and getting the characters into situations or places so that they could interact, so that they could have conflict. And so while I understand that, and while those moments did make the relationship really powerful and a strong aspect of the story, it meant that the plot honestly kind of didn't work on its own. If there wasn't this big romance plot, I feel like the actual plot of the novel just like wouldn't really make that much sense, and there would be just a lot of holes in the story. Without that romance, the book would have dragged even more, because honestly, a lot of those heavy plot sections of the novel were just kind of really boring to slog through. And the other big issue with this story is that it is a revenge plotline heist kind of story, but Deli isn't the one who is taking revenge. She's not taking revenge for herself. Deli's main motivation for taking up this bodyguard position and then taking up this new task is to have financial gain so she can support her mom, so she can support herself. And I think that's a great goal, especially with like the economic conflict between the two main characters. For the sake of the story, Deli had a very shallow relationship with everybody in the heist crew. She had a very shallow relationship with the person she was guarding. She had a very shallow relationship with the person that she was taking revenge for. And she didn't even have any connection to the main villain of the story, who kind of pops out of nowhere at the end of the book. And because of that, there is no strong reason for Deli to be doing the things that she's doing, for her to care as much as she does. And I think the book knew this because it tries to slip in a couple moments where, you know, she's taking like this thing as like a noble cause to be doing, which honestly just like, it felt forced and it didn't make sense because Deli wasn't doing it necessarily for those noble reasons, which I think is fine. She was doing it for financial reasons, and I think if that was really stressed as the main motivator, and we didn't bring in this like revenge kind of plotline, it would have made a lot more sense. Not every character has to be the super noble person, and honestly, it just, when you add those noble reasonings into places where they don't make sense, it just comes off as a little shallow and forced. The only reason I wish that Deli had some connection to the villain or the main avenging plot is because I think it would have helped propel certain actions forward a little bit better, and I think if she had a stronger or different motivation, it might have helped connect the story a little bit more. But overall, yeah, the plot was not the strongest point of the story. It was probably the weakest point, and I don't think it would have been so bad or annoying if the plot didn't drag so much, but because it dragged, a lot of the plot holes became very noticeable. So let's finish off this review with a couple random thoughts. So in the book, there's this idea of householding, which is basically like the equivalent of like courting and marrying a person. Like instead of having like your spouse or your wife, you are a householder. So this idea is implemented to make queer relationships accepted in society. There is somebody who is the householder and someone who is getting house held, I guess. Because she has the financial stability, she's the one who would be householding Deli. And again, this is a nice idea. It's to kind of make queer relationships acceptable in the society. But for me personally, the idea of householding is still kind of rooted in this weird dynamic of someone being the dominant person and someone being like the passive person in a relationship. And it's rooted in a very specific genderized role kind of situation. I think Deli and Win kind of counterbalance this really well because neither one of them is the more dominant one in the relationship, and they really work together and help each other out on things. And honestly, they're like kind of a little bit of codependence on each other was very heartwarming and endearing. Again, reading's a thing that obviously was supposed to be a way for queer relationships to happen in this world, but ended up being very weird and gendered, just made me a little bit uncomfortable, and I felt like there could be some like really bad ramifications because of that dynamic. And like I said, with the trigger warnings, content warnings, this book has a very big coverage of on the topic of addiction, specifically drug addiction. I personally do not have experience with substance abuse, so I cannot speak to the credibility of this section, but I did feel a little bit of discomfort in those sections. I wouldn't say that Deli is an unreliable narrator, but some of her thought processing is wrong, and it's never quite commented enough in the narrative, and I could see people not being able to pick up on that distinction because it's very, very subtle. And so some of Deli's thoughts and actions towards her mom and her addiction just felt just like not super well done in my personal opinion. I did like how their relationship still remained really complex and nuanced, but I kind of wish that Deli's thinking would have been called out by the other characters a little bit more. Again, overall, I enjoyed this book. I'm really happy to get a sapphic fantasy novel, but I had to dock it down like a couple stars because one, it was a slog to read. It really, really tested my patience at the end of the story, and because the plot wasn't super interconnected and there were a lot of plot holes. So yes, would I recommend this book? Maybe to a very specific audience. I do think people are going to love this book and like it, but for me, it just didn't tick all those boxes that I'm looking for, and I felt like it was a very average read in the end. But yes, those are my thoughts on The Ruthless Lady's Guide to Wizardry. Maybe not a perfect book, but I would give it some love because yes, we do need more sapphic fantasy out there. If you've read this book, I would love to know your comments down below. If you've read a good sapphic bodyguard story, let me know in the comments down below. I would love to know about it. And yeah, I'll see you guys later with another video. Thank you so much for watching and happy reading.